Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Dotterer, and I'm coming to you live from the East Coast here in the United States. And we have a very special show today on this historic day, November 22nd. It's 2023, but I'm going to go back to 1963, which I was 3 years old, and I'll never forget my mother coming into the room. And I think I had chicken pox, I think I had chicken pox, and I was in my crib, or I was in my bed. And my mother came in the room, November 22nd, 1963, and said, "The president's been shot. The president's been shot." And I'll never forget that. And since that time, I've studied President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's life and his legacy. And I want to bring on a good friend of mine who I met when I was a freshman at Stanford, and we've been friends since 1979 to this day. And he's someone that has studied President Kennedy's his background. He came actually to Stanford. He came to our campus, Stanford University, when he was a young man. And the stadium behind me was historic because and he's going to, my good friend Jim Rutter, I'm going to bring him on now, and he's going to talk about why Stanford Stadium had some significance in that tragic day on November 22nd, 1963. But the thing that I do want to say is President Kennedy's legacy does continue, and that's we should also celebrate his life and what his vision was for America. So without further ado, Jim Rutter, welcome. You're on the dot.
Good morning, Dot.
How are you?
Great. Really excited to have a chance today on this very special historic day to be able to celebrate the life and legacy and policy agenda of our 35th president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a Democrat, the first Roman Catholic Irish president, and also he was the youngest president when he was elected. He was the youngest president at just 43 years old, and which sometimes we forget how young he really was. And as with all human beings, he had his strengths and weaknesses, but we have to remember that he was an extraordinary individual who accomplished incredible things in his short lifetime. And there's so much that we can learn from not only from his life, but also the discussions that he started on a variety of issues that became really the focus of national attention during the years he was president. It's sad that it was only 3 years, just over 1,000 days, but there have been books written about what might have been had the president not been killed and had he continued to push for his legislative agenda and how he conducted himself in foreign policy. So many unfulfilled aspects of his mission. And then, of course, many lingering questions surrounding his death and the motivation that people might have had, the motives people had for bringing to a conclusion his time in office, tragically.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for coming on the show on the dot. I know you gave a short talk last week at the Stanford Faculty Club, and you've done a lot of research and in this on the life of President Kennedy. And I want to thank you for encouraging me to ask you 3 questions that I've come up with. And you can elaborate on these questions and share your knowledge of President Kennedy and his amazing life and legacy. So the first question, Jim, I have for you is reflecting on President Kennedy's term, what do you believe were his most significant contributions or policies that have had a lasting impact on American society and politics?
Well, it was a very turbulent time for our country as we were emerging, still in the post-war era, coming out of the 50s, heading into the 60s. There were a number of key areas where Kennedy was active. And I want to preface this by saying, by no means am I an absolute expert in JFK. There is so much material out there that no individual could ever learn everything about the president or the years during his presidency. There are over 40,000 books that have been written about the Kennedys as a whole, and 1,500 plus books just about the assassination itself. So there's an enormous amount of information. Many have tried to put this in a historical context, or have explored certain aspects of his presidency or of the assassination. I look back and I see what was going on at that time. We were coming through the Cold War. We were about to engage in a number of national crises, including the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the coup that we tacitly approved of in Vietnam. These things all were front and center on the foreign policy side, but you also have to realize what was going on within our own country. We were, as we are today, a divided nation that was in need of some self-reflection and some adjustments. Kennedy gets a lot of credit for advocating and pushing for civil rights. You might say he was pressured to advocate for civil rights by activists and by certain constituents that were vital to his electoral campaign, and a lot of the work of his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. All of these things were part of what drove Kennedy to push on the civil rights agenda. Let's face it, 3 years into his first term, he didn't actually get as much traction with all of this as he would have liked to. And it wouldn't be until the following year that we pushed through the Civil Rights Act was 1964, well after his death, and it was part of his ongoing legacy. But it wasn't all that. When he ran for president in 1960, he went up against Richard Nixon, famously went at each other in a televised debate that Kennedy came away looking very polished and presidential. Nixon did not. He ended up winning that 60 election, which allowed him to really set forth his plan. He had promised the American people through the new frontier. Well, what was the new frontier? It was a lot of things, right? He had to combat high inflation. He had to look at extension of unemployment insurance and extension of Social Security benefits, and was looking at large increases in welfare benefits. So there was a lot of controversy, just as there is today. We had people with differing views in any democracy that's supposed to be healthy. There was a lot of debate going on in all of these areas. He did not have 100% support at all, as far as on the national level or within Congress, or even within his own inner circle and the executive administration at the time. There were differing opinions among his generals about the conduct of everything from our foreign policy in Cuba to our relationship with the Soviet Union. We were driven to the brink of nuclear war during the early part of his presidency. So these were very serious issues, and it's remarkable that a man of his relatively limited foreign policy experience, he'd had a chance to live when his father was stationed as the ambassador to the court at St. James in England. Kennedy got to live and see what was going on in Europe firsthand. He spent a lot of time reading. He was well-versed, but not that experienced. And so you have a 43-year-old president who immediately is dealing with the CIA's activities backing the Bay of Pigs, the disastrous Bay of Pigs that was, part of the lack of execution of that initiative was the lack of air cover from the U.S. military, because Kennedy didn't want it to be seen that the U.S. military was backing basically a regime change in a country, despite the fact that, on the other hand, there was a lot of pressure to avoid the communist incursion into our hemisphere that occurred after the Cuban revolution in 1959. And there was a lot of concern about the domino theory and having other countries in Central and South America go the way of socialism/communism. So part of his agenda was also the Alliance for Progress, which was a number of programs designed to help eliminate poverty and build up education and reform in Latin and South American countries. So much was going on. He also represented a tremendous hope for the country at a critical time. The space race with the Soviets after Sputnik, he came out in one of his famous speeches saying, we're gonna try to land a man on the moon, before the end of the decade. And while he didn't get to personally experience the moon landing that happened in 1969, which I watched on live television, by the way. In 1962, however, he did get to see John Glenn be the first human being to orbit the Earth in a space capsule. So that was, the hope, the taking on the challenge, his famous speech about asking not what your country can do for you. It was about taking on new challenges. And so those new challenges, we've got to remember at the time in 1961, when he assumed office after the election, I mean, he was sworn in with his oath of office. And as is always the case for a president, it was a dangerous world. And it's a dangerous job, and always was and always will be, because if you're representing a country, you're going to be the target of attention, and your power and influence is going to be perceived both as an opportunity and a threat by a variety of constituents. So as far as the policies that we take away from Kennedy, I think it has to be remembered that he didn't get to finish most of what he started. It was more a direction he was taking us in. I think it was, fairly liberal on the political spectrum, be considered by conservatives at the time to be very, very progressive. But it was trying to make the country more united, solve some of the economic disparities, and try and keep us out of Vietnam in terms of armed conflict. These were things we have continued to wrestle with for the next 6 decades. It's been 60 years and we're still dealing with high inflation. We're still trying to stay out of foreign wars. We're still trying to find economic and social justice, however you want to define that, because we're a nation that's constantly evolving. And luckily, we're still in a democracy, and we're trying to be a melting pot. We've had huge amounts of immigration coming into this country. And is it a melting pot, or is it just pots of metal that's yet to melt? We'll see. But what Kennedy did was allow us to at least to have the dialogue and to think ahead. And that's one of the things I admire most about him, was that he was willing, and through his brilliant oratory skills, he was able to speak directly to the American people in a way that I think was inspirational for almost everybody, even some of his adversaries, and was particularly inspirational to young people, people of color, anyone who felt misrepresented, felt that here was a president that was trying his best to do a better job and have the country do a better job. So my lasting impression of John F. Kennedy is that he didn't get a chance to finish the job. His life was taken in the second quarter.
Yeah. What's amazing, Jim, about President Kennedy is all those things that you alluded to happened within just 1,000 days. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was thrust into so much. And I was listening to one of the documentaries on the History Channel the other night, and I wasn't aware of how close during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was one admiral in the Russian fleet that they needed 3 confirmations to launch a nuclear weapon. Are you familiar with that
I
situation?
mean, we're right on the brink. I mean, it really was very close, closer than anybody really knew at the time, because as is the case with most things, we don't always get all the information until a later date for national security purposes and others. It was dangerous. The Cuban Missile Crisis has had its own books and movies and documentaries and interviews, and it was a very difficult time. And Kennedy's approach was very different than some of his military staff would have liked. There were others more willing to risk a nuclear exchange than Kennedy was. Some people felt we should go in and immediately send our military forces into Cuba, not only to stop the missiles, but also to make a change in the government, which there was a lot of pressure from the anti-Castro Cubans, particularly down in South Florida, to make that happen. Well, Kennedy, using his own maturity and good judgment, was able to take a different approach and try the blockade. And that brinksmanship led to the blinking, as it was called by the Soviets. But at the same time, we gave up some bases in Turkey that were considered to be by the Soviets to be a threat to them. So his pursuit of peace, his desire to avoid armed conflict, not shirking responsibility as a major power, but to try and find a way to look for commonality, look for ways of resolving problems amicably through compromise and negotiation rather than just through the exercise of military power, went a long way to keeping us from disaster. And that was at a time when we didn't probably have all the same information available to us about what was going on the other side. So the chances for things to get out of hand were much higher without all the same signal intelligence and all that we enjoy today. It's a much more dangerous world in some ways today, but at least we have open lines of communication for the most part. We have a lot of technology that allows us to know what's going on in various parts of the world. So avoiding global catastrophe, certainly he deserves a lot of credit for making that happen. There was probably some luck involved, and it could have gone a lot of different ways, but you have to give him credit for his patience and for his unwillingness to overreact and to take a measured approach that ended up being pretty effective.
Yeah, I think if it weren't for President Kennedy, we might not be on this on the dot, because I didn't realize how close we were to catastrophe. Again, I didn't know there was one Russian general, or admiral, I should say, that said, no, we're not going to launch the missiles. And, here we are today with the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in the Gaza and the Strip. And we're back where we were. I mean, and I think hopefully we can look back in history and look what President Kennedy did, I think, to save humanity. I mean, there were generals that said, no, we gotta fight the Russians. And, his peace speech, could you talk a little bit about the speech that he gave at American University, Jim, that actually was, and I just learned this as well, he didn't want everyone to hear the speech because it was controversial, but it was something that he got on record, and it was an amazing speech. Could you talk a little bit?
Well, you have to remember that the historical context was we'd come out of World War II as really the sole great power. Europe was tattered and torn. The Soviet Union was still recovering from the war. Economically, we were miles ahead in terms of industrial might. So there was a feeling that the U.S. could pretty much exercise its will. Well, if you're the strongest power, you need to set an example. You need to lead by example. And if you're going to, the political science will tell you that realism involves the pursuit of national interest. And at that point, Kennedy, who had watched the formation of the United Nations, felt that may or may not have been a successful way of going about trying to get some sort of a concern beyond our own national interest, realizing that no longer was it about doing what was in the best interest of the United States, but what was best in the best interest of the world. So that Kennedy, recognizing that times were changing, that the threat of nuclear war changed really the way we had to look at the future. It was that forward-looking recognition that was so important. And then that's combined with his ability to express his ideas and get people to at least consider thinking differently. Had he been less skilled as a speech strategist, because he really did, he got advice from some very, very good advisors, and he had tremendous speech writers, Ted Sorensen and others, who did a brilliant job of utilizing speaking techniques that allowed him to address very, very important issues in a way that people could easily understand. And I'm not sure we see that every day in our current leadership of the last 10, 20 years. Barack Obama was a very gifted speaker. However you feel about his policies, he was a very gifted speaker. That gave him a certain amount of power. And Kennedy had tremendous power and influence because he was such an incredibly gifted speaker. So he used that by going around and being present at universities, at major events, on the campaign trail, where his ability to address the important issues of the day served him extremely well.
Yeah, I was very fortunate, Jim, when I worked at the United Nations many decades ago, to meet Teddy Sorensen and his wife. And what a nice man. I mean, grew up in Nebraska, and that famous quotation, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country," I believe was scribed by Teddy Sorensen. So
right.
He was, yeah. And, I'm getting back on script because I know I've gotten a little bit off script. The second question, Jim, and you've probably answered this in so many ways earlier in our discussion. In your view, how did the tragic events of November 22nd, 1963 shape the public's memory and perception of Kennedy's presidency and his overall legacy?
Well, that's actually kind of a multi-part situation, because his actual assassination involved shock and sadness and concern when the leader of the most powerful nation in the world, who had just shepherded us through a number of significant crises, when he is suddenly eliminated, there was a feeling of, my God, what are we going to do without our leader? Who could have been responsible becomes another complete question. And then the loss of that voice is significant. So the nation was shocked and saddened. Also, there was complete disbelief that this could happen. There was certainly a general understanding that we had a Secret Service that was protecting the president. He was such a well-loved figure by so many throughout the international community as well. He was handsome. He was charming and charismatic. He was a beautiful speaker. He dressed well. All of these things. People just couldn't believe that that could be taken away. And then the fact that it happened with modern news reporting. There wasn't actual live broadcast of the assassination other than the Zapruder film, but there was, certainly as the aftermath of the assassination itself, the arrest of Oswald, the killing of Oswald by Jack Ruby, Dallas nightclub owner. This was captured on live television, and the nation. This was sort of the dawn of 24-hour news coverage. The major networks went on for days at a time covering this story. It became such a part of people's lives. It was right in their living rooms, and then they watched that history continue to unfold as there was an attempt to make sense of all of this through the arrest and through the initial interview, and then as events unfolded, it became increasingly complex, and you were then left with an incredible mystery. Who did this? How was it really done? Who could have been responsible? Because there was an anger as well. There was a public desire to know not only what had happened, but who was responsible. So the death in some ways took away some of that hope and optimism that followed the post-war period, and it reminded us that the world was a dangerous and sometimes disheartening place. So that was hard for the national psyche. And then what also developed as questions went unanswered, whether it was disagreement with the Warren Commission conclusive findings or newspaper coverage, there was a distrust in the story the nation was being told that carried on beyond just this issue and became a distrust in government overall. And so the fact that people no longer, there was a quote about not trusting anyone over 30. And that came from, wow, we always sort of assumed goodwill from our leaders, from our government. And now we were being asked, do we trust the Dallas Police Department? Do we trust the FBI? Do we trust the CIA? Do we trust the military? These are all good questions. Whether or not there was full disclosure of everything that happened, people's perception was that maybe we weren't told the whole story. And that continues 60 years later and is the subject of speculation to this day.
Yeah. And, one of the things I encourage anyone that's tuning in or going to watch this video, Dorothy Kilgallen, I've mentioned her name to you on numerous times. Could you just mention a little bit about Dorothy Kilgallen and some of the research you may have done about Dorothy?
I haven't really looked into her. There are a number of figures whose testimony and eyewitness accounts and relationships have been explored in depth.
She was the last person to interview Jack Ruby.
Right. So, Ruby was arrested and was held for a long time before he eventually died of cancer. He could only really give insight into what he did. I don't know that we learned a lot about what the greater forces were behind his decision. We always heard his direct testimony was that he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the difficult experience of going through going through Oswald's trial, and so that it was more of allegedly a revenge play to take out Oswald because of his admiration and respect for Kennedy, which in itself is a believable story. Mike, you could tell me if you've done more on how her interview shed light on anything beyond that, because the rest is it's hard to prove speculation without evidence.
Well, I
know it's of great personal interest to you.
Well, it is because, I remember her on that show. What was the famous show that she was on? She was one of the members of a show. I don't know, it was To Tell the Truth or What's My Line? I forget the name of the show. But she was a very famous journalist. I mean, everyone knew Dorothy Kilgallen in the 1950s, the 60s. Her father was a famous newspaper man. And she interviewed Jack Ruby, and she told her friends that she was gathering information on the assassination, and then mysteriously she died. And they, I again encourage everyone, without getting into too many details, but how many people mysteriously died that were connected to the assassination, Jim? I mean, it's
certainly there's a long list of people who were unavailable as eyewitness to provide testimony, and it certainly seems like an extraordinary number of people. We probably can't tell on an individual basis who who died of natural causes or natural sequence of events, but it certainly did nothing to douse the flames of conspiracy theorists. I'm not a conspiracy nut, but I'm a big believer in conspiracy. And in fact, if you ask me at the end of the day how I feel about the likely responsible parties here, it probably is some sort of what would be classified by some as a conspiracy theory. One of the things that's important to note is the CIA, for example, one of their most successful propaganda campaigns is to discredit conspiracy theories and to make everybody sound like a nut. Well, I think, all we're asking for is the ability to have the questions answered and to have the information declassified so that people can make reasonable determination of their own. The problem with declassification, it took 60 years and we're still not finished. We keep releasing more and more, trying to protect national interest or protect vulnerable people in the field, whatever it may be. The reality is we don't even know how much information was destroyed. We don't know how many documents disappeared. We don't know how many people disappeared. But we do know that there was a lot of redaction. We do know that the CIA, in allowing their people to be interviewed during the Warren Commission process, prepped those individuals with how to answer questions and which questions would be allowed. So when you have characters like J. Edgar Hoover and you have Allen Dulles, and you have who had been, by the way, fired by Kennedy, forced to resign by Kennedy. So you had an angry ex-CIA director. You had a very well-known, unique character in running the FBI. It's not unreasonable for rational people to prefer having more transparency. We all know that when you're investigating a crime, you like to look at what? The evidence. You like to look at opportunity. You like to look at motive, all of these things. And was there a complete investigation that involved gathering of all forensic evidence? Why was why were the bullet fragments in President Kennedy's head never retrieved so they could be matched forensically to the alleged bullets that were to have killed him, and the rifle that was to have done it, and the person who was alleged to have fired the shots through the rifle? I mean, there just was not kind of a normal sequence of events, including what they've called the fraudulent autopsy. Why wasn't the autopsy done in a normal way? Was it because of, the president's wife didn't want it done in Dallas? Normal police process. This was an unprecedented event. It was a crisis, and people acted in a variety of ways. There was probably some panic. There was probably some expedition, and there was probably some guidance from other powers other than those that were trying to get to the conclusions we could draw from the medical and forensic evidence. That's not unreasonable. You're not a nut to question that.
Yeah, and as you said, there's still information that we're still gathering, and they're still releasing documents that have been, I guess, not released. So it's and if you look at the 1960s, Jim, and you and I were both, you were born in 1963, correct? Were you born in
10 weeks before the assassination?
10 weeks before the assassination. I was born in 1960, and you look at the 1960s. You had Malcolm X, killed, assassinated in 1965. You had Dr. Martin Luther King killed in 1968. You had President Kennedy's brother and then senator, who I think probably would have been elected president. I think he would have defeated Nixon. He was assassinated in 1968 as well. I mean, if those four men had lived, do you think history might have been different?
Well, I think that's without question. We don't know, who was responsible for many of those in terms of the overall motives. In some cases, we have pretty good evidence on who the assassins were, why they did it, what forces could have been at work will probably remain a mystery. But certainly, those were, assassination changed the way public figures interact, where they can feel safe, and probably changed the people that are willing to do public service. So it's hard to speculate on where a future RFK presidency would have gone, or what could have happened with Martin Luther King, or what was the impact on the civil rights movement of some of the more radical elements. You want to call it radical or activist, depending on your perspective. But certainly throughout the course of history, deaths have happened, and people have chosen to solve problems with violence, and they've been known to trigger major global conflict because it becomes a very emotional, inflammatory situation, and that sequence of events can get out of hand. We're lucky that there wasn't that we've been able to draw positive things from the legacy of those individuals you described.
Yeah, well, Jim, I mean, there's no question one of the very sad blemishes on American history is slavery. And, my father, as you know, was a Major League Baseball player. And in the 1950s, his Cincinnati Reds would go down to the South and play, in Atlanta, Georgia. And Frank Robinson and Vada Pinson and Kurt Flood and the African-American players would have to stay in different hotels. And, all of that was going on. And during John F. Kennedy's administration, he had to send the National Guard to Alabama to say to the governor, sorry, you got to move aside. So when you think of those kind of things, and here we are today, which is, I think we've come a long way. We still have a long way to go, but it's pretty amazing what the leaders, made us all aware of in the 1960s, that what was going on was just terrible. And unacceptable.
As we said at the beginning of this chat, these were turbulent times, and the civil rights situation that's one of the many parties that you could speculate might have had something to do with this assassination. Conservative Southerners. Remember, this was in Dallas where he was. Why was the president there that day in Dallas? He was there because he was trying to win popularity and votes in Texas, which was a key swing state. But it was also a conservative Southern state that was not promoting progress on civil rights. And we talk about the abolitionist, anti-slavery movements that continued on from the time of the Civil War. There was no national consensus there on progress there being in everybody's interest. So the fact that conservative Southerners might have resented Kennedy is not too surprising. That was seen in a number of his policy initiatives, and sometimes you make enemies along the way, whether it's in your in Cuba or civil rights or nuclear disarmament. He had the test ban treaty, banning all tests other than I think it was underground tests. Those were huge accomplishments for Kennedy. I think he considered the test ban treaty to be his greatest accomplishment during the time of his administration. But almost every policy had groups that were opposed, and it was an era in which people tried to take matters into their own hands.
Well, Jim, thank you for kind of going with me, getting a little bit off of the 3-question script. I've got one last question, and then maybe you could mention, a little bit about Stanford Stadium and the band and
Sure.
The national anthem, a little bit of history of bringing Stanford in. And I know Stanford is playing Notre Dame this weekend. So who knows, you might want to make a prediction on the score this weekend. But
we actually played Notre Dame back in the early 60s as well, in 63 and 64. So it's interesting that we're going to be playing the Irish this Saturday.
Yeah.
Did you have a final question?
Yeah, I'm going to have the final question, and then I'm going to try to share my screen, because you sent me some great pictures, and I was trying to download it, but whatever. It said So I'm going to share my screen. Some of those pictures that you sent were fantastic. So the final question, and I'm going to, as we do on the dot, you're going to have the last word. So this will be the last time I talk. You've got the stage, and you could take us out from this point on. So I'm going to last question, and you could take it over from there. Here it is, Jim. And again, thank you so much for coming on the dot. And we can't wait to have you again on the dot. Maybe to talk about Stanford basketball. How we maybe can go to the March Madness later this or next year. Okay, here's the question, Jim. Considering John F. Kennedy's famous quotation, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," how do you think this sentiment has influenced American civic engagement and public service in the years following his presidency? And again, thank you, Jim, for coming on the dot. Take it away, brother.
So again, that question you said in the years following his presidency, I think initially it was highly inspirational. It was having a young president who was hopeful, who was advocating for change. All of those things resonated with our nation's youth, and his creation of the Peace Corps, which he had his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, heavily involved in leading that group up. The Peace Corps was an attempt to use American resources, its young people, to serve overseas and help promote a positive image of the United States, which was going to be helpful in global leadership and setting a good example for a chance at international peace. All those things were damaged by Kennedy being shot. So in the aftermath, that optimism turned into more anger. The desire to have productive, peaceful change probably was replaced by activist protesters against everything from our continuing and entrenched involvement in Vietnam. There were the March on Washington happened. There was a lot of pressure to continue with civil rights that Johnson, coming in after the Kennedy death, finally did help get through. But the Ask Not was an attempt to have, I think it clearly was an attempt to ask us to not follow just our national interest, because it was going to be too dangerous to do that in the post-war environment. So it's great to ask people to put their nation first, or their nation's interest first, but it wasn't really the kind of populism you see. It was more an internationalism that Kennedy was advocating for, and trying to get people to be more positive and to keep an open mind and think for themselves. All these are good things that we would do well to embrace them probably today. I'm not sure, looking back, whether I would have voted for President Kennedy. I probably would have, even though I might not have agreed with him on everything. But he was an inspiring leader, and that the nation could use more of those. How his rhetoric might have been effectively channeled into action remains to be seen. We won't really ever know. I do know that very few people in the 60 years since have been able to inspire as wide an array of different groups within our country as Kennedy did. Not even Obama was able to have as widespread an impact on people. Yeah, what you're seeing there, I actually in middle school did a report on John F. Kennedy. There I am at 10 weeks. But as was the case in the 70s, we did a lot of book reports and biographies. And one of the ones that I did was on John F. Kennedy. And I did receive an A minus for that report, Mike, but the minus was allegedly for extremely poor handwriting, which is unfortunate because I think that if he'd focused on the content, it was pretty good. I read it recently, and it's really not bad for something written by a 13-year-old. But you can see now on the screen, you're seeing some images. There's just an enormous amount of material. You could spend the rest of your life reading about Kennedy and his policies and his legacy. The national fascination has led to countless documentaries and podcasts. There's an excellent entertaining podcast going on with Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien right now on iHeart Radio podcast. That is, I think it's several episodes in now, but it's about a 10-part podcast that you mentioned, the History Channel. History Channel's been running a series called Kennedy that's outstanding in its images and its portrayal. It's narrated by Peter Coyote. It's very good. There is going to be a Netflix series called Assassin or Assassins that will be on Netflix, I believe, and it's in the style of The Queen. And it is going to look at the Kennedy assassination as if indeed the mafia had been involved as part of the conspiracy. So that should be very interesting. These are the 4 presidents that were assassinated during their term in office. That's, of course, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. So of our 35 presidents up to Kennedy, we'd had 4 that were killed in office. Those are the 4 now that you see. We're now up to Joe Biden as our 46th president. And, hopefully we won't experience this again because it's truly awful. But nothing compares to Kennedy in terms of the media coverage and the amount of literature that has been produced surrounding his life and times. He was quite the athlete. He was a football player in middle school and high school, and he ended up being on the Harvard football team. He got injured playing tennis. He had lifelong back problems. You learn so much about Kennedy. He suffered greatly from pain. He had Addison's disease. He had colitis. He had major back issues, which were not helped by being further injured during the war. And at the same time, he had this youthful vitality that he was able to project because people didn't realize the pain he was in. He still managed to play golf, play touch football, these kind of things that were reassuring and inspiring the American public, but belied the experience of the man himself. He was also a football fan. He attended a lot of events. He went to the Army-Navy game. There was one Army-Navy game in '63, I believe, that he attended where there had been actually an attempted assassination, or at least planned assassination of Kennedy at that football game. Luckily, that didn't happen. You see his daily life here at the White House. His children were young. This was part of his massive appeal to the general population. He had a pretty wife. He had cute children. He liked sports, and his wife was dressed in Oleg Cassini, and he wore Brooks Brothers suits. So all of these things added to the public's fascination. These were rock stars. They were the American royalty. And then we had this unspeakable tragedy occur. And so it's important that we remember how special this guy was, what a tremendous start he had to his presidency. We will forever lament the fact that we didn't get to see how that game plan would unfold. And it's pain, it's tragic. We'll never probably get over it. Anyone who witnessed this in their lifetime. So we try to convey the gravity of that loss in speaking to young people. I spoke to a number of groups this week at the John F. Kennedy Middle School in Redwood City about helping ensure that they understand more about the life and the political life, the personal life, the tragic sequence of events, and then the legacy of the man himself and its impact on American politics and American culture going forward. So these were some of the slides from one of those presentations this week. Now, as far as the Stanford football connection, the assassination took place on November 22nd, which was a Friday in 1963, and it was the next day that the big game between Cal and Stanford was scheduled. So we're talking 24 hours before the scheduled kickoff. There was an immediate, following the assassination, there was immediate discussion on whether they would play the game. In fact, the Athletic Association of Western University presidents convened an emergency call and determined that they were still going to play the game. Then they turned and changed their minds and said, no, we're not going to play. Most of the schools, the Big Ten, the Ivies, all suspended their plays, their games. Stanford had a lot of events surrounding big game. The traditional bonfire and rallies and parades and everything that was going on all got canceled. All of the corsages wilted as they postponed the game for a week. The game was actually played on the 30th of November, the following Saturday. Stanford did win that. I think it was 28-17, benefiting actually from the extra week because a couple of their key players had injuries they were able to recover from during the week and were able to play. But when the game was finally played, there was a really very moving, unforgettable experience for those in attendance. Arthur P. Barnes, Dr. Barnes, was a Stanford band leader, and he wrote a special arrangement of the Star Spangled Banner that was really unique and would become iconic, having first been played on the occasion of the game on the 30th of November. He designed an arrangement that had a lone trumpeter do the first several stanzas of the Star Spangled Banner, and then the rest of the band would join in. I recommend it's available. That recording was included on a 1970 Leland Stanford Jr. Marching Band, University Marching Band album, and it's on their greatest hits CD. It can be found, and it's very moving. Still done at football games today in the same way, and so that's an ongoing tribute that happens on a regular basis at home games for Stanford. So pretty amazing that Stanford and the other schools were able to postpone their games. The NFL played their games. The AFL did not, but the NFL went ahead and played their games on that Sunday. And those were not broadcast by the networks. The networks decided not to broadcast them, and there were no, to my knowledge, radio broadcasts either. So it really was, it was really a one way we could immediately honor the fallen president, and really still do to this day. So that was for those that were there. I had a gentleman who's on the board of the Stanford Faculty Club this last Friday. He let us know he was in the band and played in that famous rendition, and there was not a dry eye in the house.